Yeah, thank you very much, Kashanti Sara. And yeah, welcome to those of you online from me as well. And yeah, you've got Dhardo Rimpoche right above your head. So that's very auspicious. There he is. Yeah, wow. So, yeah, I hope this morning that I'm going to be able to share something of Dhardo Rinpoche's life with you. It is a very rich life. And I do recommend this wonderful book by Suvadra, who's a member of our order, called The Wheel and the Diamond. And it's about the life of Dhardo Rinpoche. And it's quite, it's a shortish biography, but it's well worth a read because it's very rich. And then the other book I just wanted to recommend to get even more of a sense or a different sense of him is this book. It's called Dhardo, A Celebration. And it's a number of different people writing about their experience of meeting Dhardo Rinpoche. So Westerners, but also children who attended the school that he set up, people who were very close to him. And you get a real sense of him through this. So yeah, if you do want to follow up after the talk, those are a couple of things you could do. So yeah, I hope to tell you a bit about his life, a little bit about why that might be relevant for us today. Something of my own connection with him will be sort of woven into the talk, I'm sure. And yeah, also his connection with Triratna and our teacher and founder, Sangharakshita. So it's quite a few things. So it might become a bit like a little collage. I'm not sure. My talks aren't always completely linear, so we'll see. Yeah, as Kashanti Sara said, I do make things. And one of the things I make are collages. So sometimes my talks end up being more like a collage than a linear talk. But let's see how I go. So, Dhardo Rinpoche, well, he was born in, I think it's 1918, and he was born in a place called Dartsendo, which is in eastern Tibet. So that's quite a long time ago. And yeah, he was recognized at the age of 3, I think, as a tulku. So in the Tibetan tradition, I don't know how much you know about that, but with very important tulkus or teachers, sometimes they have a tulku who's the next one in a way, like the Dalai Lama is probably the most well-known of that. So there was the 13th Dalai Lama, there was a 12th, etc. And now we've got the 14th one. So Dhardo was recognized, and at an early age he himself said that he was waiting for some people to come and find him. So yeah, and then when they did come, because they went back to the place where his previous incarnation had been, when they did come they brought all the different things that the previous Dhardo had owned and put them in amongst lots of other things that he hadn't owned. And of course, as is often the way with a tulku, Dhardo recognised each thing that had belonged to the previous tulku. So whatever we make of this, it's kind of interesting. And yeah, when he later went to study at Drepung Monastery near Lhasa, and he waited a few years. His parents, in a way, didn't necessarily want him to be a religious figure because they'd already, I think one of their other children already was recognised as a nun or something, and so they wanted Dhardo to sort of stay with them, but as I say, he didn't. But he did, first of all, study more locally. And even from the age of 3, he was learning sutras and texts, and he learnt them off by heart. And yeah, then when he moved at the age of 8 to Drepung Monastery, he was really revered as he arrived. There were lots and lots of people, and he was just this small boy, aged 8, and they were all sort of throwing scarves at him and, you know, revering him. And he realized, he knew that he wasn't a bodhisattva. He knew he wasn't a bodhisattva, but he decided to do all that he could to become one. So he decided to practice as faithfully and as strongly as he could to really learn the Dharma so that he could practice with wisdom and he could practice with compassion. And so he really applied himself to study. Study was very important to him, and it was quite a rigorous training. So this is medieval classical Tibet, I guess. And, you got up really early and you studied and you studied and you learnt things off by heart. And apparently he would only move on to the next thing once he'd understood and really understood what he was learning. So yeah, he had a very good mind. And it was said that he had encyclopedic knowledge. He could quote sutras at his fingertips, and he learnt them, off by heart. So he had very good teachers, and one of the teachers that he had was appointed partly because he also had quite an understanding of Tibetan history, Tibetan culture, things like astrology, Tibetan art, things like that. And he was one of his main teachers, and he learned a lot from this teacher, and he really revered him. And the teacher was quite strict, sometimes to the point of actually hitting Dhardo, which nowadays, would be not obviously something that would happen, or at least, but it was Tibet as it was in those days. But in spite of that, and the reason he hit him was because, he had, done something that didn't go with his sort of, his wish to be a bodhisattva. So an example was that there were some Nepalese pilgrims chanting mantras, and they were chanting in Sanskrit. And Dhardo had never heard anyone chanting in Sanskrit, and he was just a young boy, I think, really. But he started laughing because he felt like they weren't pronouncing the mantras correctly. And his teacher really pulled him up on that. But he said it made a big difference to him. And as I say, he continued to revere his teacher and felt overall his teacher was very kind. So one of the things that happened when you were studying in this way was that sometimes you didn't get that much food to eat. So, there was some rules around when you had your food, and also there were rules around sleep sometimes. So one of the things that Dhardo had to follow at some point was to go to sleep, but without showing any part of his feet or his head. So that meant basically that he had to sit upright to sleep and cover his head and his feet and sleep sitting upright. And he also had to eat all his food before 12. And it was pretty hard, actually. He did really well with his studies, but he also did struggle with his health at times, not surprisingly, when we think of how arduous that would have been to study in that way. So at some point, his health actually really needed some attention. He really did need to do something. So he went to India for a while. So he moved from Tibet and went to a much warmer climate. And there he met a doctor who gave him medicines, a Tibetan doctor, and also he just spent a bit of time in the sunshine, and he found a more sort of natural way, you could say, of practicing, where warmed by the sun, he was just very naturally then drawn to meditate. So that had a really big effect on his health. And he didn't really suffer much ill health after that, because this time in India really made a difference to him. And while he was there, he also went to various different important Buddhist sites that he hadn't managed to be in before. So this was around 1947, when he was around about 20, I guess he was 29 then. And so he'd done a lot of his training, and he went to India. And this was way before any real Tibetan Lamas had been to India. It was only later, when there were various invasions from, well, the British invaded Tibet, and so did China on several occasions. It was only then that Tibetan monks left Tibet. So he was quite rare in that he came to India quite before all of that. So when he came back to Tibet, he really wanted to do more study. So he started to do that. And then a couple of years later, there had been a small Tibetan gompa or temple set up in Bodh Gaya. And the Dalai Lama really wanted Dhardo to go back there and be the abbot of that temple. And he didn't really want to go because he wanted to continue with his studies. But obviously it was the Dalai Lama asking him, so he decided he would go. And it wasn't easy to go there. Partly the temple had already been set up, and some of the practitioners there weren't being as ethical as they might have been. And he did have a bit of a struggle on his hands, but he really tried to include everyone there, but also create something of value and a temple that was worthy of the tradition there. So he tried to later create a rest house, for example, for any pilgrims that came to the Tibetan temple in Bodh Gaya. And some of them would have travelled a long, long way from Tibet to get there. So that was something that he did. But while he was in Bodh Gaya, he also became very aware of the different rumblings in Tibet. As I said, the Chinese invaded a few times before they actually invaded the big invasion in 1959. So you could say at a distance, he could sort of see what was coming. He could see some of the writing on the wall, really. And I guess he started to really think about what might be needed when all these different people might have to leave Tibet. And one of the things that really concerned him was obviously the sort of preservation of the teachings of the Dharma, but also he was very keen to preserve Tibetan culture, and that included, like the history, the literature, the arts, those kind of things. So at some point, this became a bigger and bigger sort of, bigger thing in his mind. And eventually he set up in the hill town of Kalimpong, he set up a small school there. And the school, I need to read out the actual name of the school because it's the ITBCI School, which is the Indo-Tibetan Buddhist Cultural Institute School. So it's got quite a long title. So it's often shortened to the ITBCI School. And he started it. And there were already a few Tibetan children in Kalimpong. And he used to go to Kalimpong and sort of move between Kalimpong and Bodh Gaya. And he started the school before there were a mass exodus from Tibet. So he already had some students there. And he funded it with, well, it wasn't easy to fund it. He was given a building by somebody, which was a bit ramshackle, and they sort of did it up. And the school, you know, kind of survived. And in order to be able to preserve the Tibetan culture, what that meant really was that he couldn't just take funding from the Indian government, because if he had, the Indian government would have just wanted the school to be run on the same lines as all the other schools in India. And that would have meant that the Tibetan culture would only get like maybe 45 minutes a week. And he really didn't want that to be the case, because he felt like it was very important, as I said, that the culture was preserved, the language was preserved, and that the children actually knew something of their homeland. And yeah, so he had to really look for donations elsewhere, and the school often struggled and lived on a bit of a shoestring. And it wasn't until much later when a couple of Sangharakshita's disciples, students, order members, went to India, met Dhardo Rinpoche, and then came back and did some fundraising. And eventually, Aid for India, which later became the Karanar Trust, supported the school for many, many years. And it still does support what is now a museum. So the school eventually did close, but yeah, there's still a museum with some of Dhardo's typewriters and record players and various artifacts that belong to him. And Karanar still supports that. So you probably all know about the Karanar Trust because it's in this building. And I had asked Akasha Mitra a while ago what would happen to the school, and also Karanar's connection with it. So yeah, so something is still there. So yeah, Dhardo also got asked if he would be the abbot of another monastery, and this monastery was in a place called Goom, and Goom means, I think, mist or fog. So it was in a very particular place, which involved, I think, a 3-hour journey from Kalimpong. And, you know, it had a really, it was very high up. And so he would also go there and he would do teachings there. He didn't stay there all year because it was quite an arduous journey, and then also quite an arduous place to live. The rooms were very cold. So he did go and he gave teachings, and he remained the abbot of that monastery for a very long time. So he had these 3 things he was doing. He was the abbot of this small Tibetan temple in Bodh Gaya. He was also running this school, and then he was the abbot of another monastery in Goom. And all of those things were really important to him. So those are the 3 main things that he did. So while he was in Bodh Gaya in 1949, he happened to look out of the window one day of the Tibetan temple, and he saw a Westerner dressed in yellow robes. And he was amazed. He was just simply like astounded. And he said to his companion at the time, "Oh, Buddhism has actually made it to, you know, other countries, far and far away, European countries, you know, Western countries." And though he didn't know it at the time, this person was actually Bhante Sangharakshita, who happened to be in Bodh Gaya at that time. So he's the founder of Triratna. So Dhardo saw him and was quite struck by him. And that was their first kind of meeting, if you like, although it wasn't a meeting where they actually talked, but they did see each other. Well, Dhardo saw Bhante. Bhante didn't see Dhardo. And then later, Sangharakshita did move to Kalimpong, and they got to know each other really because sometimes Dhardo needed help to translate letters. He spoke very good Tibetan and he spoke Hindi, but he wasn't, English was quite hard to learn. And Sangharakshita was living in Kalimpong and Dhardo heard about him. And so sometimes he would go and visit him and ask him if he would be able to translate something. It might have been a request for perhaps donations or something, a letter he needed to write. And Sangharakshita knew Hindi, so they communicated in Hindi. And they also got to know each other just from being in each other's orbit, I guess, in that town for quite a long time. Apparently Dhardo Rinpoche always took his own paper when Bhante was going to type up the translation, and he'd always take some carbon paper as well. So, he didn't sort of assume anything. And apparently he also kept lots of little things just to save money, like pieces of string and bamboo canes that he would find and firewood and, little things that would just make a difference to the school and the school's finances. So, he got to know Sangharakshita. But, one thing I want to go back to is I think one of the things that really strikes me about Dhardo Rinpoche is that he lived his life and his practice from the moment that he got up in the morning until he went to sleep. So I thought I'd read you something of his program from this book. Dhardo Rinpoche's daily program ran as follows. He regularly rose between 4 and 4:30 a.m. He washed and dressed while visualizing himself in the form of a deep blue, bull-headed figure called Vajra Bhairava, or Diamond Terror, the wrathful form of Manjushri, who's the Bodhisattva of wisdom. At that time, he recited prayers of purification, repeated mantras, continued to do this while cleaning his teeth, which consequently took between 40 and 50 minutes. Maybe we all need to be visualizing ourselves in order to clean our teeth so well. He then ate a light breakfast and sat for a period of formal meditation. So he hadn't even started his formal meditation yet. And this always started with a systematic reflection on his purpose. And only when he was fully satisfied that he was not seeking blessings or personal merit would he proceed to the full practice. He engaged in an examination of any unskillful actions he had committed and made a ritual confession of them. In this purified state, he recited the traditional refuges and precepts, committing himself to the ideals of Buddhism and to the practice of ethics. He then visualized Tsongkhapa, the 14th century founder of his particular school of Buddhism, with his 2 main disciples, and recited a prayer on the 3 principles of the path. And here he symbolically established all beings in a state of purity by visualizing himself surrounded by an infinite host of beings and imagining them bathed in light, which poured from his heart. And next, he did his main meditation. He visualized the 2 bodhisattvas in female form, white Tara and green Tara. He concluded this by chanting mantras, which he might be called upon to give initiations into. He also found half an hour every morning to do some gardening among the rows of potted plants on his rooftop. If there was any time left over, he would study until lunch. This was how he spent the first 6 hours of each day, and he did that for many, many, many years. Rinpoche regarded these hours of spiritual practice as the indispensable basis for the cultivation of his insight and compassion, from which everything else in his life derived. And after that, his time belonged to the school. So he did administration, he would go and talk to the children, he would try and raise funds. Later, he passed on more responsibility to his secretary, Jampal Kalden. But at one time, he was doing all of the school's administration as well. And he would take time to meet the children, he would listen to them chanting texts and mantras, and if any child was having difficulties, Rinpoche would sit by them. And yeah, the children absolutely loved him. And then after a light evening meal, he would do another ritual, he would conclude with a puja, which he made offerings on behalf of the dead. And he usually finished between 11 and 11:30 p.m. But if school duties had been particularly time-consuming, he might not finish before 1 a.m. Nevertheless, Rinpoche considered it important to maintain his practice without missing a single day. So that's how a bodhisattva practices. I don't get up at 4 a.m., but I do find that a very inspiring, an inspiring just start to his day. And I think it was his, that program, that discipline in a way that enabled him to be able to hold these different responsibilities that he did with such a lot of both wisdom and compassion. And I chose this photo on the shrine of Dhardo with the children at the school because I really love the way the light in the photo is sort of lighting him up, and he's surrounded by some of the children in the school. And it's like he really was a light in the world, I think, as a practitioner, and and also as an exemplar of how we might bring our practice into our day-to-day lives, because sometimes that is something that we can all struggle with. How do we bring the meditation practice that we do off of our cushions and into our day-to-day life? And I think from his life we can really see what a great exemplar he was. He didn't really write books, although he did have a chapter in a book that Sangharakshita translated into English for somebody. He didn't give talks in terms of like big public talks. He sometimes did give initiations, but he was always very concerned that people were ready to receive those initiations and that they could practice them. If they couldn't, he wouldn't give them, because he realized how important the preservation of those practices really is and was. And he gave himself to a very small school. And when, lots of refugees did pour into Kalimpong later in 1959, the school was already set up. And eventually he also set up an orphanage for the children who'd been orphaned. And there were a lot of troubled, not surprisingly, traumatized, children and also adults. And he did all that he could to help them, the people in Kalimpong, whether they were living on the streets or he could house them in the school. So he really was doing all he could in the world, as well as having this very, very deep practice. There's so much in a way to say about his life. Sangharakshita also tells a story of a celebration in India in 1956, which was celebrating that the Buddha Jayanti, that Buddhism had been around for 2,500 years, and lots of different Buddhists, including Sangharakshita and Dhardo Rinpoche, were invited to that. And they had to go around India to various different places. There were new dams to see, there were temples and very sort of important Buddhist places that they were visiting. And sometimes the program would change. So they'd think they were going to a Buddhist site in the morning and a dam in the afternoon, but then sometimes things would be switched around. And on one occasion, this happened, and all the Buddhists in the party were very concerned because they were going to this Buddhist site and they really wanted to have some offerings to give, to offer up, which is of course very traditional. But they thought that they were going to be going to the Buddhist site in the afternoon, so they didn't have any offerings. And so they felt very, oh no, we haven't got the offerings. But Dhardo was always prepared. So out of his robe, he produced loads of incense sticks, lots of candles, and he gave them to everybody so that they could make their offerings. So he was always prepared. And he was never, Sangharakshita said, never caught napping, as it was, as it were. And one of the things that Sangharakshita says about Dhardo was that he really did practice the perfections. So he practiced the perfections of a bodhisattva. So generosity, ethics, energy, meditation, wisdom. He exuded them in his life. He exuded those things, wisdom. He exuded all of those qualities in his life. And I think his program really, this program that he had every day, really was the platform from which that sort of manifested, that activity manifested in the world. And in 1962, before Sangharakshita came back to England, Dhardo Rinpoche gave him the Bodhisattva ordination, and he was so pleased to receive it from Dhardo Rinpoche, because he felt in all the years that he'd spent around Dhardo Rinpoche, and they had spent a lot of time quite closely together in these travelling, this travelling that they did and in Kalimpong, that he really was receiving the ordination from a living bodhisattva. Dhardo Rinpoche also gave Sangharakshita the White Tara practice. And I think my own connection with Dhardo Rinpoche comes from a few different places. So in the early 1990s, there was an anniversary event to commemorate Dhardo Rinpoche's death, and I'll say a little bit more about his death in a moment. And this big event was in York Hall in Bethnal Green, and I'd been practicing Buddhism for a few years. I'd learnt to meditate in India, so the Tibetan tradition had been very much where I'd first come across the Dharma, and then I'd come back to England and discovered the London Buddhist Centre. But this event in York Hall, Sangharakshita was leading it, and it was a very rich event. It felt like I was back in India or in some of the Tibetan temples that I'd visited in Ladakh and Nepal, because it had a very strong kind of Tibetan feel to it, and lots of people rejoiced in Dhardo Rinpoche. And that was my first connection with him, hearing about his life. And then I must have read this biography, which came out later. And then many years later, I did a Karana appeal, and every afternoon before we went to knock on the doors, we read something from this book, the celebration of his life. And I found it really inspiring to go out door knocking in London, partly keeping Dhardo Rimpoche in mind and the school that he'd set up. Because the other thing was, we used to have a London Buddhist Arts Centre, and one day some children from the school, there was a tour that they were doing in England, and they came to do a performance called the Snow Lion Dance. And it was the most exquisite performance. The snow lion came alive in this large East End ramshackle building that used to be the London Buddhist Arts Centre. Some of you will know it if you've been to Bethnal Green. It's no longer a Buddhist Arts Centre, but again, I felt transported to somewhere else and connected with Dhardo Rimpoche. Without him wanting to preserve that culture, that snow lion dance could never have happened. And then when I was ordained, I took as my sadhana practice the White Tara practice. And as part of my own preparation for that practice, I do reflect on the lineage that practice comes from, and Dhardo Rinpoche is part of that lineage. And someone called Amoghachita, who visited Dhardo Rinpoche quite a few times to get more details about the sadhana practice that he'd given to Sangharakshita, has he has sort of made lots of notes from Dhardo. And I have notes in my own sadhana practice, and some of it says things like, Dhardo says, do this again, just to make sure. But I just love the fact that there are these little notes from Dhardo, and there's a particular colour in the sadhana practice. And apparently, when he was trying to describe the colour, he went off and found a piece of fabric, and then he brought it back to show Amoghachita, this is the colour you need to be trying to visualize or imagining, coming towards you. So those little things really, for me, make the practice of the White Tara White Tara practice very much connected with Dhardo. And I feel, I definitely feel his influence through those things. And well, there's lots more to say about his life, but just a couple of things about his death. So in, I think it was the year that he died, or it might have been just before, someone had a dream that he took very seriously. Dhardo he took those kind of things seriously. And maybe it was a bit of an ominous dream. So Dhardo decided that he would do a pilgrimage, and he went back to all the sites in Nepal that were important places. So it wasn't like definite that his death was predicted, but I guess he knew that he was getting older. He didn't know what was going to be happening. So what did he do? He went on a pilgrimage, and while he was on that pilgrimage, he gave away to anyone who asked. He gave money, so much so that his companions got a little bit worried, and they said, we won't have any money for the school, and we need a little bit of money. But he said, oh, you don't understand, I just need to give. And he just kept giving. And then for the last few months of his life, he was obviously aware that, time was running out, and he lived his life knowing that he was dying. He did a lot of pujas for the dead. He did particular things. He started folding up blankets that he would no longer need. He made new, he had new silk coverings made for all his important ritual implements. He brought out certain paintings and pictures and brought them closer to him. He remembered to give Jampal more responsibility or access to being somebody who could look after the school, so that the school could continue. So maybe that gives you a little bit of a flavour of him. But he died in 1990, and when after he died and after he'd been cremated, there is a particular tradition in Tibet where lots of, like a mandala is drawn out in the cremation stupa, and then the person, the body is put in this cremation stupa. And at the end, when the stupa, when the cremation has happened, the fragments of bone are taken out and very carefully, and then everything's removed, and there's an opportunity to see if anything remains from the mandala, which has been drawn out. And everyone was very interested to see what could be left at the bottom of Dhardo's stupa. And the two things that were very much still there in this mandala were the Dharma chakra, so the wheel of the Dharma, and the Vajra. And those were two very important symbols, emblems for Dhardo. And they very much express how he lived his life, turning the wheel of the Dharma for the benefit of all beings. And, he had this adamantine connection with the Dharma, with the lineage, and he tried to share that in a way that it would really carry on. He wanted it to carry on into the West, and to the far reaches of the world. So he saw Sangharakshita and his students as a way of doing that. He was aware of his own shortcomings in terms of language, that he probably couldn't come to the West and teach, but he did try and share all that he could with Sangharakshita's disciples who met him as well later. And I think his life is, it's very inspiring, and there's a lot more I could say, but I'm going to, I think, just finish with another short reading, and this is maybe gives us something of his life. If I can find it. Mm-hmm. So, his kindness is something that everyone seems to really draw out, which of course echoes the kindness that Ananda draws out in terms of the Buddha and his last days. So, one of the things that Vijayamala says, who writes in this book, is anyone who met Rinpoche would immediately be struck by his profound but unostentatious kindness. And she says she didn't know what to expect. He seemed so ordinary, yet extremely attentive and generous, with his time and his reminiscences, as well as with the school's meagre facilities. Looking back, What I find extraordinary is that with all my scrutiny, my desire to find a nice new category of incarnate Lama in which to place him, there was simply nothing for me to get hold of. Instead, I just had to sit there, somehow thrown back on myself by his ordinariness, my expectations rather painfully wriggling on dry land. But she also says that he wanted to give them things, and so he gave them a string of dried cheese, which was a traditional gift to travellers, though he warns them not to eat it, as it was probably rancid. And then he just seems to give. He keeps giving. He gives himself. And she says, when I get too literal about things, or I find myself looking for that big spiritual experience, I can bring to mind the extraordinary ordinariness of his presence. This gives me an almost tangible sense of what it would be like to be at the same time full of emotion and yet completely unself-referential. I know it's possible. I've seen it. So I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much.